Good afternoon. I'm Doug Irwin from the Economics Department. Pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. With President Kim heading off to the World Bank, there's been a great deal of interest about what is the World Bank all about? Why do we have it? Where did it come from? It came from the Bretton Woods conference held towards the end of World War II, 1944, here on our own state of New Hampshire, and it also created the International Monetary Fund. The Bretton Woods conference was the major conference to set up the post-war international economic system, and it was dominated by two personalities, one from the United States in the form of Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official, and the British side by John Maynard Keynes, the great economist. And of course, there was a power imbalance between the two. Keynes, of course, was a brilliant economist, but Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, had the financial and military might of the U.S. behind his positions. And this led, in the British side, to this following doggerel. In Washington, Lord Halifax whispered to Lord Keynes, "It's true they've all the money bags, but we have all the brains." At any rate, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund was to manage international financial crises. And as Mike Musa, late director of research at the IMF, used to say, we've managed to have a lot of them. And of course, on the World Bank side, the World Bank is designed to channel money to developing countries and alleviate poverty, and I think at best it can be described as a work in progress. At any rate, the Bretton Woods Conference stands as a major conference setting up the post-World War II system, and we are obviously listening. We still have its institutions with us today. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Eric Rauchway from the University of California at Davis, who is working on a major book on the origins and the impact of the Bretton Woods institutions and the Bretton Woods Conference. He is an expert on the Great Depression and the 1930s and 40s and has written a number of books, including The Great Depression and the New Deal, a very short introduction published by Oxford University Press in 2008, Blessed Among Nations, How the World Made America, published in 2006, and Murdering McKinley, The Making of Theodore Roosevelt's America, published in 2003. This talk is sponsored by the Economics Department, the History Department, with generous financial support from the Rockefeller Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rauchway.
Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks to all of you for turning out on this rainy afternoon. I hope I can be sufficiently entertaining when I talk about monetary and financial conferences, which I know is what you all have as an idea of fantastic entertainment. Actually, today's talk is going to be largely about the politics of adopting the Bretton Woods agreements, not so much about the tete-a-tete between Keynes and White, partly because I think that the tete-a-tete between Keynes and White has been covered in the literature, and partly because I think we give too little attention to the ways in which the Bretton Woods Agreement were made law and institution by the United States government, which not only had all the money, but also all the power at the end or towards the end of World War II. So I want to talk today about how the Bretton Woods arrangements came about because the Roosevelt administration was able to mobilize on its behalf a coalition of farmers and farm associations, of populists, of labor unions, and at least a sufficiently symbolic number of bankers and businessmen to support its bill for the Bretton Woods agreements as it was going through Congress. In other words, it was to a degree the last hurrah of the New Deal in its politics and in its political influence. It's also a lesson, I think, in how the things that we think we know about institutions would have shocked their creators and their originators. The way we think about Bretton Woods today is very different from the way their creators thought about the institutions as they were putting them together. So first of all, let's think quickly about Bretton Woods as a matter of history. This is probably one of the few audiences in the United States, so I don't have to tell where Bretton Woods is. Right? It's quite close to here. As you know, it's a very nice skiing and resort town. The Mount Washington Hotel, which you see depicted here, was home to the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which was held over 3 weeks in July of 1944. A few things about that. There is no such thing institutionally as the United Nations in July of 1944, not in the sense that we know it today. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference would be held later that summer, the San Francisco Conference in the spring of 1945. The United Nations referred to the nations united in the fight against fascism. It was Roosevelt's favored name for the Allies, the United Nations. It included the Latin American nations and, of course, the Western European nations, including some governments in exile, like, of course, the French and the Danes, who were there as observers. So the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference is held in July of 1944. As I say, there's no such thing yet, it really is the United Nations. This conference is part of giving it body. Second thing I want you to think about, as Doug correctly says, this is part of creating the post-war order, but of course the war is still on. Right? This is only a few weeks after D-Day. American forces, along with Canadian forces and British forces, are still fighting their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. This is a conscious decision made by the Roosevelt administration to try to avoid the errors of Versailles. They understood that by waiting till the war was over in 1918, 1919, one of the things that they had done was to allow sort of goodwill to dissipate among the Allies. And they wanted to avoid that problem by having the conference at a time when Allied cooperation was indeed at its peak, including not only the US and the UK, but also the Soviet Union, who are represented at Bretton Woods. Another thing that they were doing to try to avoid the mistakes of Versailles is, of course, that's one of the reasons they're holding it in New Hampshire. Senator Charles Tobey, who's a senior member of the Senate Banking Committee, is a Republican of New Hampshire. Key thing is he's a Republican. Right? One of the Wilson administration's major errors was not admitting Republicans into the delegations at Versailles. The Roosevelt administration was keen to have Republicans on board from the start. That's one of the reasons that the conference is held in New Hampshire. The other reason is they wanted to hold it in the summer, but someplace cool. Apparently they overdid it. All the delegates had to bring their wool socks, or so we are told. Right? So when we speak of Bretton Woods, this is the conference that we're speaking about, and of course the location that we're speaking about. The other thing that we speak about is the system that is established at this conference. The International Monetary Fund, better known simply as the Fund or the IMF these days, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, at the time generally just called the Bank, later the World Bank or IBRD less frequently, and the thing that we probably nowadays don't think about because it doesn't exist anymore, but which is in fact the foundation of the whole system, is a system for coordinating exchange rates, or the so-called adjustable peg. The idea was that by maintaining exchange rates at a fixed but adjustable level, you would be able to facilitate trade without having the problems that attended the gold standard, i.e. having to stick to the gold standard even in times of great financial crisis, which a lot of the economists there thought had caused great problems during the Depression, the recent Depression. So that's sort of a rough précis of what we're talking about when we talk about Bretton Woods. Now, when we think of Bretton Woods as institutions and its legacy today, I think of something very different. These are the Twitter results for a search for Dominique Strauss-Kahn on May 15th, 2011. The number one result was that nobody told Dominique Strauss-Kahn that being director of the IMF doesn't mean you get to do to people what the IMF does to countries. This is the number one result, mind you, right ahead of the IMF's own statement. Right? This tells us something about how people regard the IMF nowadays, and of course, as Doug rightly pointed out, people tend to view the World Bank as at best a work in progress and sometimes a lot worse than that. So when we think about the IMF now, though, we think of it sort of as the agent of what we have lately been calling austerity policies. Right? The agent that will impose austere policies on countries that are struggling already in exchange for extending credit to such countries, nowadays on the periphery of Europe in some cases. Right? They will urge them to dismantle or defund components of their welfare state and various other forms of state spending. If we compare this to how the IMF was regarded in 1945, both by its proponents and by its opponents, we'll see that in fact it was rather different. And I'm giving you now 1945 because, as I said at the outset, the adoption of Bretton Woods is, I think, at least as important as the thinking up of Bretton Woods. Right? The Roosevelt administration, having secured the agreement of the 44 countries at the conference, then has to get it through Congress, which, as you know, of course, again, was something they were unable to do. The Wilson administration was unable to do in 1918, 1919. Right? They had their agreement and then they couldn't get it adopted. So the effort to get it adopted and the way that they talk about the agreements when they're trying to get it adopted are at least as important, I think, as the thinking up of the agreements. For example, when we think of labor's stake in Bretton Woods, which is not something necessarily that we would think of nowadays, we see that labor in 1945 regarded Bretton Woods plans as links in a chain we had to forge to make a better world. Right? Nowadays, of course, we tend to think of unions as being opposed to the IMF and globalization and all that they represent. Not so in 1945. Right? The same when we think of another pamphlet that was funded by the CIO's PAC in 1945. It's not only easy to understand, but it's very important to the average citizen. Again, we tend to think of Bretton Woods as something fairly abstruse that doesn't touch the ordinary person, the man in the street. They were keen in 1945 to say, no, it's just as much about bread and wages as it is about a village in New Hampshire. Bretton Woods, as its origin was, as I set out, was about creating a coalition for international capitalism. Right? That's the idea, to revive the international capitalist system, to revive trade, to revive capital flows to the degree possible among countries that would include bankers, farmers, and unions, premised on an argument that Bretton Woods would lead to full employment and increasing prosperity. It was tied to the full employment bill that had gone before the United States Congress and the idea of high and rising real wages. And again, as I say, I want to talk about 1945 rather than 1944 because I want to think about the politics of this. The conference is held in the summer of 1944. Almost as soon as the conference concludes, it's set aside by the White House because they go into presidential election mode, and nobody wants to hear about exchange rates, adjustable or not, during presidential election season. Once you get past presidential election season, you're largely into the holidays and Christmas. It's not till January of 1945 that the Roosevelt administration again picks up Bretton Woods and seeks to have it adopted by Congress. And they seek to have it adopted by Congress. They don't seek to have it adopted as a treaty by the Senate. This is a strategic decision that's made by the Roosevelt administration on the grounds that, having conversed with congressional leadership, it would actually be easier to get it through both houses of Congress on a simple majority than to try to get it through 2/3 of the Senate. Having gone through this process, they decide that they're going to be able to sell Bretton Woods. Now let me talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of what it is that they're selling and how they got to this point. When we think about these things, as Doug pointed out, we tend to think about the intellectual conflict between Keynes and White. We also tend to think about Bretton Woods as an Anglo-American stitch-up, as they would say in the UK. In truth, I think it's important to realize that Bretton Woods began before Keynes and White began their discussions, and it outlasted those discussions as well. The system that we now think of as Bretton Woods shows up much, much earlier in Treasury records, as early as 1934, when Harry Dexter White is not actually working for the Treasury yet, and is asked by Jacob Viner, an economist consultant to the Treasury, to report on what kind of monetary standard the United States ought to have. This is in 1934. The context of this is that in 1933, as one of his first actions as president, Roosevelt took the dollar off gold. In taking the dollar off gold, he suspended convertibility of all paper dollars into gold, and a few weeks after that, required Americans to turn in their specie to the Federal Reserve. So they ended up with a lot of gold and silver on hand. At the time, Roosevelt said privately, or off the record, that he regarded this as a permanent move. They were moving to a managed currency. But they weren't sure as yet what that managed currency would look like. And in 1934, in January of 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which permitted the president to peg the dollar value of gold, which he then did, at $35 to an ounce. It was sometimes after this that Viner asked White to write up a report on what kind of monetary standard the United States ought to have. White replied at considerable length, sort of a 300-page report, and he said, look, we could have a gold standard like we did before, which we pledged to convert the dollar to gold at a certain rate. That would carry with it an increased volume of trade. It would also make it more difficult for us to have our own domestic monetary policy in times of crisis. And in my estimation, White said, the advantages to trade will be far outweighed by the disadvantages of keeping to the gold standard in times of economic crisis. We could have a flexible exchange rate, White said, but this would not be respectable and would not induce confidence in the dollar. There is a third way, says Harry Dexter White in 1934, and that is to have what I call the international gold standard. White says, now I'm using the term gold standard in this phrase, international gold standard, purely as a courtesy. People like the words gold standard. It's not really going to mean anything in terms of the actual functioning of the system. We'll have the dollar nominally pegged to gold for international purposes as we do now. We will pledge to maintain that exchange rate, But we also reserve to ourselves the right to move it when the dollar has reached what he called the safety point in this document. This is, in other words, the origin of what we now call the adjustable peg, which is the basis of the Bretton Woods system. We will have a pegged value for the dollar to other currencies, but we will move it when we need to. And he said, in order to forestall moving it, we will have a large fund, a large monetary fund, which will trade internationally. It will be composed of all the specie that we have just taken away from the American people, some billions of dollars, and we will use it to trade in foreign exchange in order to maintain our exchange rate to prevent our having to devalue it. The bigger the fund, White writes, the better, because the longer you can forestall an inevitable devaluation, maybe render it not inevitable at all. So this is the origin. You get your International Monetary Fund and you get your adjustable peg in the context of the Roosevelt administration's having gone off gold in 1933 and trying to decide what to do next, in the context also of trying to preserve the maximum flexibility in recovery from the Depression. This is what's on the mind of Harry Dexter White. It's this report that gets him hired permanently to the Treasury and put in charge ultimately of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is the large fund that is used to try to maintain the exchange value of the dollar. So Bretton Woods has its origins in the very earliest part of the Roosevelt administration. In this same report, White says the important thing is to attempt to arrive at conclusions on the best course of action, irrespective of popular opinion, and then attempts to swing public opinion. White himself and Keynes are involved in the first part of this sentence, right? Arriving at the best course of action that they possibly can, irrespective of popular opinion. It's the second part of this opinion in which White and Keynes are actually shunted aside politely, and the Roosevelt administration swings into high gear. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Keynes is British. And ultimately, however many brains the British may have, they are declining as a world power. The British government has made the decision not to consult Parliament about Bretton Woods until the American Congress reaches a decision itself. So they've decided to wait and to see what it is that the United States will do. So Keynes is basically out of the picture after the conference in 1944, at least for the time being. White is taken out of the picture because he's not very polite, basically. Morgenthau allegedly once threw him out of the meeting for using four-letter Anglo-Saxonisms, and he was considered too likely to do this in the public and sort of was kept, therefore, on the back burner for the time being. And the idea of getting Bretton Woods through became the project of Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the other men at the top of the Roosevelt Treasury. Now, you may say to yourselves, what kind of challenge was this? Why should it have been difficult at all? Well, there was a substantial argument against the Bretton Woods agreements. And the argument against these agreements came from a sector which might surprise us today, which is to say from American bankers. The American bankers were very thoroughly and in some cases violently opposed to the Bretton Woods Agreements Act and mounted a substantial public campaign against it. Contrary to Harry Dexter White's argument that the larger the fund would be, the better it would be, because the longer you could forestall revaluations of currency, the American Bankers Association took the position that the large fund was dangerous because it could be inflationary. The bankers took the view that the danger of inflation after the war was possibly the greatest danger facing the world, and overexpansion was a threat to be avoided. Again, peculiarly given the way that we think about the Bretton Woods institutions now, the bankers favored the adoption of the World Bank and opposed the adoption of the International Monetary Fund. It's partly because the bank was a bank and it worked on banker-like principles, whereas the fund was a sort of peculiar entity that they professed, anyway, not properly to understand in terms of its extension of credit to member nations. It's partly because the World Bank was sold as primarily being an agency to guarantee private lending rather than to make loans of its own, so bankers naturally viewed it as a way of facilitating their own business, whereas the International Monetary Fund would quite possibly take away the business of international banks that had done currency exchange prior to this point. So the concern was that if credit, and by credit they meant currency, was too easily available, governments would use it irresponsibly, That's what the financial news, anyway, had to say. If you looked at the head of the Bank of International Settlements, Thomas McKittrick, he suggests really what we need to do is to reduce costs. We could deflate ourselves to prosperity, as some cynics nowadays say, right? Then unemployment would be short-lived. That what we really needed to do, the bankers said, was to substitute, we could not substitute, rather, for balancing budgets, these strange new institutions like the International Monetary Fund. Now, when the American Bankers Association, which is the main trade association for American banks and headquartered in New York City and run by a vice president of the National City Bank of New York, comes out against a major piece of banking legislation, you might suppose that would be trouble for the Roosevelt administration, and indeed it was. When the American Bankers Association says that the IMF is unsound in principle, the response amongst the press is basically, well, it must be unsound in principle. As this quotation from a Newsweek reporter suggests, the idea is that the bankers in New York know what they're talking about. And so when the ABA says no to Bretton Woods, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times largely follow suit. So you have a case where the major trade association of the industry involved is against this legislation, and where the New York press, or as we would nowadays say, media, are against this organization. And the Roosevelt Treasury is faced with the question of what to do. Perhaps surprisingly, these days anyway, it's surprising, the Democratic presidency does not simply fold its tents and go home. Instead, what they do is they begin to campaign for Bretton Woods amongst other parts of the country. Morgenthau and his associates at the top of the Treasury decide on a massive public relations campaign on behalf of the Bretton Woods legislation. The first part of the campaign, they said, is to be a legitimate information function. The second part is the aggressive selling of the idea by non-government forces, which ostensibly will have responded to the education phase. The word ostensibly is important there, as is the presence of the word legitimate in the first part of that sentence, clearly implying that the second part is not quite as legitimate. What the Roosevelt administration set out to do was to tell the public what Bretton Woods was and then to present the public with the impression that non-governmental agencies broadly supported it. And the political consultant whom they employed to do this or to organize this effort for them said, we will have to work right to left. We should work right to left. Articulation in favor of the proposal should come from non-Treasury sources in this approximate order: conservative financial circles, other conservative business circles, conservative political circles, peace and good government organizations, State Department and others of the more conservative government agencies, labor and liberals. Labor and liberals being last from the people among the people from whom the public should hear about Bretton Woods. As I say, this was a report given by a professional political consultant with the slightly improbable name of J. Randolph Feltus to the Morgenthau Treasury. Now, where do you get a professional political consultant? Well, they have to be paid. Right? And if you're going to create an ostensible non-governmental reaction to support the Bretton Woods legislation amongst American NGOs and so forth like that, that's going to have to be paid for too. And the question is, how are you going to pay for this? Can't pay for it out of the Treasury. That would be unseemly. Right? That would be almost like propaganda. That would be using like federal money on behalf of a partisan purpose. So instead, the Treasury managed to get a lawyer to sign off on the idea that they would use the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which you will remember Harry Dexter White was running through the 1930s, to pay for this publicity effort on behalf of the Bretton Woods legislation. The Exchange Stabilization Fund was a paper profit that was created by the devaluation of the dollar in terms of gold in 1933-34. So again, the origins of Bretton Woods go back to the very beginning of the Roosevelt administration, when Roosevelt took a dollar that had been worth $20.67 to an ounce of gold and made it worth $35 to an ounce of gold. A large paper profit was created. All the gold that they had on hand in the Treasury was suddenly worth a lot more than it had been. And they said, let's take this money that we have just invented and we will put it in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and it will be set aside at the largely discretionary use of the Secretary of the Treasury for the purposes of stabilizing the value of the dollar. Well, in 1945, the Treasury lawyer says, it's my view that the Stabilization Fund can be used to publicize the program developed at Bretton Woods because it's supposed to stabilize exchange rates, and the fund is for the stabilization of exchange rates. We can tell that this was viewed with some skepticism even in the United States Treasury at the time because some high official has written in the margins of this memorandum that this is ticklish. Nevertheless, this is where the money comes from. So once the money is, which is a very large amount of money that's available now, it's used to buy off-prints of articles, it's used to pay for political consultants, it's used to pay to send Henry Morgenthau and various others, including Dean Acheson, representatives of the Roosevelt administration around the country to give speeches. Now you remember the sort of outline that I gave you of the plan of working left to right. The Morgenthau Treasury does roughly that. The Morgenthau Treasury is one of the most wonderful government agencies in history, perhaps as wonderful as anything except the Nixon White House, and that is in respect of recording its own activities. Right? There was no taping system in the Morgenthau Treasury. However, if you look in the so-called Morgenthau diaries, there are transcripts of almost every phone call, every meeting that Henry Morgenthau took with all of his subordinates all day long. And you can see the Secretary of the Treasury in action, which I know is a thrill to everyone. Nevertheless, in an instance like this, it's actually quite interesting to see real politicking done, right? Especially, as I say, by a Democratic administration. So you can see, for example, them deciding we need some bankers to be in favor of Bretton Woods. Now, it's not as if the American Bankers Association is the only banking association in the country. It may be the major one, it may be headquartered in New York, but there are still regional banks in the United States which are independent of New York banks, and we could make sure that they were able to respond favorably to Bretton Woods as against what the ABA was doing. So they made sure that the Independent Bankers Association would be able to issue a report in favor of Bretton Woods, but they were concerned that this would get the president of the independent bankers fired from his current position at a major bank. So they decided, well, we will make sure that the Federal Reserve will have a job outstanding for him in case he is exposed to censure as a result of being on our side. So the term independent and the term Independent Bankers Association is perhaps used rather loosely in this case. However, the independent bankers come out with a report in favor of the Bretton Woods legislation, and perhaps more critically, Henry Morgenthau begins to use his contacts among independent bankers to try to politic on behalf of Bretton Woods. As he says here, we have to work from the grassroots. Right? This is a question of reaching senators and congressmen. The way to reach them is to reach their local bankers, to reach their local newspaper editors, and to get them to say, we are in favor of Bretton Woods, and to put influence from a community basis on these political figures. Henry Morgenthau can do that. Why? Because first in the Roosevelt administration, he organized the Farm Credit Association, which put him in touch with all kinds of regional and small banks around the country. And second, as Secretary of the Treasury, he sold war bonds for 4 years as head of the Roosevelt administration's Treasury, which again put him in contact with bankers all around the country. Henry Morgenthau can call any banker in the country and be assured that he has a good personal relationship with that person and say, we need you to be in favor of our Bretton Woods legislation. And you can, as I say, see him doing this in his own memoranda and the transcripts of his own telephone calls. So that's your sort of financial sector taken care of. You can't win over Wall Street, but you can win over the regional banks. And the Treasury works very hard to do that and produces some adequate results at the end of the day. The second thing that they said would be to work on businessmen. This is less difficult. Collier's magazine is aimed at sort of the American businessmen with a certain literary sensibility. On the understanding that our post-war leadership must come from business, they produced its first pamphlet, number 1, which explains, as it says in the title, the ABC of Bretton Woods. It's aimed at the sober, no-nonsense businessman. It says that this is really about practical self-interest. Right? The language of selling Bretton Woods here to business leaders is one of practicality, of pragmatism, of what experience has taught us from World War I, that the United States has attended Bretton Woods out of enlightened self-interest, that this is a program informed by experience, and it's a probability of being effective. This is the sort of what we would nowadays call the messaging of Bretton Woods to the business community. And again, it's quite effective in getting American businessmen on board to support the Bretton Woods agreements. It's supplemented, again, by speaking tours by various Treasury officials. Henry Morgenthau goes to Detroit and talks about how many more cars will be sold and various other knock-on effects if we have the Bretton Woods agreements and the ability to engage in international trade with greater confidence than we could before the war. The Treasury decides that the messaging, as I say, would be extremely important, that we need to sell Bretton Woods when we go to the peace and the good government organizations, which we're now down further in the list, as part of a larger program of international cooperation. So Bretton Woods would be seen as of a peace. Right? There was the Bretton Woods Conference, there was the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, there was the Yalta Conference, which was then not held in the bad odor that it later would be, and the San Francisco Conference. All of these things would be symbols of how the Roosevelt administration was going to create a post-war order in which there would be greater international cooperation. And Bretton Woods, coming to Congress first, provided congressmen and senators with their first opportunity to demonstrate that they would be in favor of such a system. In order to persuade people, particularly people in the Congress and the Senate, that they ought to support Bretton Woods, they thought they had to simplify the message of Bretton Woods quite extensively. This extended as far as working closely with the League of Women Voters, who was very cooperative apparently with the highest levels of the Treasury, to produce a children's book about Bretton Woods to show how uncomplicated, in fact, it could be. To tie the motive for establishing the Bretton Woods system to learning the lessons of the interwar period. So the story of Bretton Woods was that bad trade practices, right, had caused or helped exacerbate the Great Depression. Nations had erected tariff walls. You can see them right there, with Uncle Sam turning his back to the boats sailing up to and being blocked by the tariff walls. These tariff walls lowered the level of international trade. Factories were closed. People grew poorer, 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 thinner, thinner, thinner. Some ways this book is more successful in explaining Bretton Woods on a level of children. Other ways it's less successful. One of the ways in which it's less successful is here, I think, in discussing the dumping of trade goods on other countries. Germany dumped lots of junk upon poor Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia started to object. Yugoslavia had to take them. This bad trick was called a bilateral clearing agreement. Try that one out for your bedtime reading. Right? Immediately afterwards, we get another bad trick was called competitive devaluation of currency. Right? But right, the idea here is that economic warfare of the 1930s led to militarism. This kind of bad policy and failure to cooperate among nations led to the war, but that Bretton Woods was going to solve all of these problems because we had all the brainy fellows discussing finance and exchange rates and economics at Bretton Woods. Truly international gathering, black men and white men, brown men and yellow men from 44 different countries with just one idea. Right? Again, it's encapsulating the idea of the United Nations in this simple pamphlet behind the Bretton Woods system, which is going to prevent, right, the errors of the interwar period. Oh, and by the way, the book ends, be sure to tell your parents that you're in favor of Bretton Woods and that they should write their congressmen and their senators. Right? This is a choice between isolation and economic cooperation. I hope they choose cooperation. Don't you? Right? All the lessons of the world we needed to learn, we learned in kindergarten. So please have them write your congressman to decide to vote yes on Bretton Woods. This is, as I said, only one of a series of pamphlets that the League of Women Voters produces, but this one is aimed particularly at getting children to propose the adoption of Bretton Woods agreements to their parents. As far as getting the good government organizations like League of Women Voters to support the Bretton Woods agreements, this is fairly typical. It emphasizes the virtues of cooperation and the simplicity and the obviousness of these programs and their superiority to the problems of the interwar years. Moving yet further to the left, we get to labor. Labor's stake in Bretton Woods was a CIO pamphlet that was generated by the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The Treasury was also allowed on the CIO's radio program to promote Bretton Woods and worked closely with CIO in several cases and also the CIO PAC. Right? Labor's stake in Bretton Woods was again to prevent the problems of the 30s. The language here is obviously very different from those aimed at the good government organizations and those aimed at the businessmen. There's this idea that we can get 60 million jobs, right? That American policy should be aimed at producing 60 million jobs, that the only way we can get there is by larger quantities of international trade. The only way we can get those is by having some system like Bretton Woods. But we also need to prevent fascism, right? The kinds of problems that we had in the Great Depression. And the argument here is that the rise of fascism was, of course, abetted by the Depression. So if we have Bretton Woods, if we have a job creation program, we can prevent the return of fascism, we can prevent the rise here of gangster parties, because what we need is full employment. Full employment will be greatly helped by freeing and sustaining international trade. Again, not something we would expect to hear from labor unions in recent years. But this is CIO speaking, and a CIO PAC funded another pamphlet called Bretton Woods is No Mystery. This was illustrated by Sid Hoff, who became a very popular children's illustrator later years. If you had Danny and the Dinosaur with your kids, that's Sid Hoff, right? Again, it uses the same kind of imagery and language to propose the adoption of Bretton Woods. We stop speculators and international bankers. Here's Mr. Speculator heading on towards World War III, right? And of course, their political allies. Here is one of the opponents of Bretton Woods in the United States Senate is Robert Taft, whose initials conveniently are R-A-T. Right? Here he is seeing the money bags with its sexy legs walk by. Right? We need to stop, right, the political allies of speculators. Again, the emphasis is on the simplicity and the democracy of Bretton Woods. Right? We had the right people in charge in the 1930s, the so-called right people, clearly. The right people with the right safeguards. What do we get? We got world depression, fascism, and the worst war in human history. We need the ordinary person, right? We need the Roosevelt administration. The CIO, in the course of explaining why workers should support Bretton Woods, says simply in a one-sentence paragraph, President Roosevelt was the architect of Bretton Woods. So while we may think it was John Maynard Keynes or Harry Dexter White, as far as the campaign to get it adopted is concerned, you need to understand that it was President Roosevelt, that it was the Roosevelt administration that brought you the New Deal, that brought you the Wagner Act, that brought you recovery from the Great Depression. It's the Roosevelt administration who you can trust to engineer our way into the post-war order. As the CIO News says, for post-war prosperity, for our 60 million jobs, for men and women, we can't have them unless we expand trade beyond the highest point of 1929. Bretton Woods will make this possible. For full and unfettered world trade, we're going to need Bretton Woods. I say much of this takes place in print because that's the culture of 1945, but Bretton Woods is actually inescapable. On 1 week in March of 1945, just as the House Banking Committee is taking up hearings on the Bretton Woods legislation, right? If you turned on your radio on almost any of the networks, you could not escape hearing about Bretton Woods. You would hear Robert Taft debate Dean Acheson on the Blue Network, right? There is the State Department, one of the more conservative government agencies, telling you why you should support Bretton Woods. On the Mutual Network, you would hear Taft again, and U.V. Wilcox, who is one of the American Bankers Association's economists, debate Charles Tobey, who was the New Hampshire senator, who was a Republican in favor of Bretton Woods, and Mr. Gregory, who was the head of the Independent Bankers Association. This program called the Town Meeting of the Air had Harry Dexter White debating Randolph Burgess, who was vice president of the National City Bank. CBS, the People's Platform, featured Ansel Luxford, who was an attorney for the Treasury Department, talking about why you should support Bretton Woods. And if you got tired of all this sort of thing and you decided to have some music, you would find to your consternation that the intermission of the Metropolitan Opera program, you would hear Will Clayton, who is the Assistant Secretary of State, talking about the importance of Bretton Woods legislation to the country. This is as much of an all-out publicity blitz as you could care to see or hope to see engineered, and the result is quite favorable ultimately to the Roosevelt administration. In June, Bretton Woods is adopted by an overwhelming majority, 345 to 18. In July, by the Senate, by an overwhelming majority again, 61 to 16. You can look at this and say to yourself, they may not have needed to go to all this trouble. They might even have gone to the Senate and gotten a two-thirds majority as it was. But it's always easier to say these things retrospectively than it is prospectively, and it's hard for us to say what the effect of the publicity campaign was, how many more people supported this afterwards than would have done before. Unfortunately for us, there's only really one set of Gallup polls on the Bretton Woods legislation, and they're not held far enough apart to really have enough meaning for us in terms of seeing minds change. But it is clear from these Gallup polls that those people who have heard of Bretton Woods, which is a minority but a large minority of respondents, are aware of at least what the administration wants them to know, that it is part of an overall plan for world peace, that it is associated with Dumbarton Oaks, and that it is to do with money and trade. So when we think about Bretton Woods then, we think about something very different, I think, from when we think about Bretton Woods now. Bretton Woods then is very clearly a sort of capstone to the New Deal programs and also a keystone to a cornerstone to the Roosevelt administration's post-war order. At its origin, as I said at the outset, we're looking at an effort to combine sort of New Deal constituencies in support of Bretton Woods, to look to regional, non-metropolitan sources of support, the same kind of support the Roosevelt administration had had since its start, which is, of course, when the idea of Bretton Woods originated. And the hope was, at least by some of the people who had helped to create these institutions, was that this goal and this backing would continue into the post-war period. Harry Dexter White, when he was named as one of the US directors of the International Monetary Fund, wrote a long memorandum on how the fund should work in 1946. And he said, if the fund is used to influence member governments to pursue sound policies, it would be a failure. It would play a minor and probably an unfortunate role in future economic developments. Of course, this is, as I say, what we now tend to think of the fund as doing, of using its leverage to impose or influence member governments to pursue sound policies, precisely the opposite of what White said it should do. Or to come back to the May episode of last year and to our Twitter as an index of modern public opinion, here's another reaction to the episode, this one from the film critic / pundit Robert Ebert, simply noting that International Monetary Fund now reduced to raping people one at a time. This is partly the difference between how we view the fund now and how it was viewed then, partly has to do with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system almost immediately after its creation in 1947 and the need to revive it in the context of a Cold War order, supplement it with the Marshall Fund. It's partly to do with what happened once the Bretton Woods exchange rate system was dismantled by President Nixon in 1971, 73, and the recreation of the International Monetary Fund and its new lending facilities for poor and struggled countries in the 1970s. And it's partly also to do simply with good old-fashioned regulatory capture, where agencies that are created to mind industries often end up in hock to those industries. When asked why he thought Bretton Woods would get through Congress in 1944, John Maynard Keynes had a couple of answers to that question, based on his cursory and actually rather amateurish understanding of American politics. One of the things he said was basically, this is a boring subject. It would be very difficult for any congressman or senator to credibly get out in front of it and say, well, I'm against this system of pegged but adjustable exchange rates and this International Monetary Fund for the following reasons, and not make mistakes. And of course, Keynes said they don't want to seem to have made mistakes. And so it is the very dullness of the subject that will work in our favor in getting it past the United States Congress. I hope, if nothing else, I've persuaded you that Keynes was wrong, that it is not a boring subject, and that there's a lot to talk about here. And at this point, I'd be happy to take your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Marshall Program, Marshall Plan?
Well, the question is, how does this tie in with the Marshall Plan, the Marshall Fund, the Marshall Plan for European recovery? By 1947, it seemed clear that the World Bank, which was, as I indicated, actually properly called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was simply not up to the task in terms of its funding for reconstruction and development. Roughly a third of its available capital had gone in its first loan to France for reconstruction. That was letting development go by the wayside. Right? So, then, plus, there was considerable fear by 1947 that advancing communist influence over Western Europe was going to lead to the fall of some Western European governments to communism unless something could be done to shore up the commerce and trade in those countries. And so that helped swing public opinion behind an increased level of funding to those countries for recovery, which of course came in the form of a speech that George Marshall gave initially at Princeton and then later at Harvard, calling for these large sums of money to be spent to keep the communists at bay and to promote freedom. So it was a much larger sum of money than the bank had available, and it was used specifically to keep communists out of the system. Now that's in stark contrast to the original intent of the system. This is another whole talk that I could give. But the Roosevelt administration had originally hoped that the Soviets would sign onto the Bretton Woods agreements. In fact, not only did they hope, they tried very hard to get the Soviets to sign onto these agreements. Harry Dexter White and several other Treasury officials met over a period of weeks and months with the Soviets in the spring of 1944, coming into the conference to try to get out of the way remaining Soviets' objections to the plans. When asked how it would work if you had a country that had state trading and state control of the currency rate to be involved in a system like Bretton Woods, White answered, well, they could simply change domestic prices, right, in order to keep them more or less involved in the system. They tried to arrange a Soviet loan. Right? The Soviets, for their part, seem to have been very sincere, or fairly sincere anyway, about negotiating a place in it. They participated actively in the Bretton Woods Conference, much more so than they would in later conferences. It's not until December of 1945, and what is sort of the very last minute, that the Soviets opt out of the Bretton Woods plan for reasons that remain obscure. It's somewhere between Molotov, who's the finance minister, foreign minister, and Stalin himself, someplace that's not documented as far as we know, that the Soviets opt out. But down to at least the end of 1945 and coming into the beginning of 1946, which is when Kennan writes the long telegram saying, really, you can't trust the Soviets, the intent is that Bretton Woods will involve the Soviet Union. So it's not until you get past 1946 and the long telegram sort of sets American policy in stone that you begin to see the need for some way to keep the Soviets at bay, and that's when the Marshall Plan begins to seem like a good idea, rather than a truly international system, more of an American system.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I think my question next to your very last comment there. One of the characteristics of Bretton Woods institution that's often discussed today is the dominance of the United States, and especially symbolized by the American prerogative of choosing the World Bank president. Was this at all an issue in the campaign in 1944 and 1945? Were there concerns about encroachments on American sovereignty that the administration tried to address?
The question is about the control that, or the influence the United States seemed to have over the system today, and whether there were concerns raised about this possibility in 1945. And the answer is yes. First of all, I mean, the thing to note perhaps about the structure of Bretton Woods is it's not like the United Nations. The United States doesn't have a veto. Right? The United States has a large block of votes, because the block of votes in the fund are associated with the size of the contribution to the fund, and the United States is making the largest contribution. But it's not a majority. It needs to have allies. And at the conference, it's actually not even set up that way. It's one nation, one vote. So in the initial phases of setting this up, when the Brits and the US are in fact trying to stitch this up, they have their pre-conference meetings and they agree that maybe the best thing is to not allow votes. Because at the conference, the Latin American nations, which would simply be the most numerous, would be the largest block, voting block. So they try to avoid having votes at the conference, and in fact, when Keynes is chairing the sessions on the bank, he doesn't have any votes. He says, I see that there is a consensus agreement of whatever it is I want to do, and now we're going to do that, right? All of you who have been in meetings with department chairs know how this works, right? Once you get into the actual operations of the fund, the ability of the United States to sway the largest part of the votes, but not the majority, does become an issue again between the US and the UK. Especially once you have a socialist government in the UK, they're less enamored of Bretton Woods, and in fact, the Attlee government establishes something called the Committee on Bretton Woods, which they form an association with some members of the Bank of England to try to see whether they should get out of Bretton Woods. And part of the problem is that they can't see a way to vote with enough nations to outvote the United States. So even though the United States doesn't have the majority power, they still have a big enough power. And in fact, it's very alluring to this Attlee committee that when Mao takes over China, they think, well, maybe a socialist China would vote with the UK against the American, although they ultimately decided that would be unseemly. But at least there are calculations of this sort going on. In the actual sort of 1945 period that I've been talking about, the only people who raise this question are people like Taft, who are opponents of, as you suggest, giving up our sovereignty, right? We are giving them our money. And the ABA's sort of way to try to deal with is to propose amendments to the Bretton Woods Acts, which would give the United States more control over the agencies. Now, some of these are adopted, but most of them are not. But they had hoped to see an American agency, American board, which would include sort of private members of the private banking sector, have veto power over whatever the U.S. delegates to the fund and bank would do, so they could have more control over what would be done with American money. The Roosevelt administration's response to this was generally, the amount of money you're talking about is roughly 1 week's worth of expenditures on the war, and is not really worth fussing over in terms of getting it into international hands. And at the time, that seemed to be fairly persuasive.
Given that the IMF and to some extent the World Bank have a pretty bad PR problem today, why do you think it is that so foreign for efforts such as the one that tried to spread to reform public opinion? Or do they not really need public opinion than anything else because they
So the question is, given that the World Bank and the IMF have such PR problems today, why isn't there a similar attempt to shore them up, presumably from the U.S. administration, right? Well, I mean, one is tempted to respond first of all that whatever its merits, the Obama administration is not the Roosevelt administration, right? I mean, it operates in a very different fashion. Partly, of course, those are structural constraints. I mean, I indicated that what Morgenthau did when faced with the opposition of the New York banks and the New York media was to go to the regional banks and the regional media. Well, the regional banks and the regional media basically don't exist, or they don't exist certainly in the way that they did then, right? There isn't that vibrant periphery with quite the amount of political and financial power, not to mention power to shape public opinion that you could go to. It's dominated by national chains and things like that. So even if the administration did want to do this, it would be difficult. Second of all, why would the administration want to do this? Right? Inasmuch as the IMF and the World Bank have problems, they're not the Obama administration's problems. In fact, it's quite handy, perhaps, to say, oh, that wicked old IMF helping to cause problems in Europe, it's therefore, not our problem to solve. Right? Third, it's I mean, I'm not sure if I'm the third or fourth, but anyway, next, the IMF has to do more to solve its own problems in particular. I'm not sure the World Bank's problems are of the same ilk, but the IMF, has to solve its own problems in that respect. I mean, Christine Lagarde appeared to try back in January. I don't know if you remember this, but she went around Davos waving her custom, designer handbag, which must have cost $1 bazillion, dollars, saying, look, I have my bag out for a handout, right? We need more money so that we can have more stimulative policies in the periphery. And it didn't seem to have worked. In fact, so far as I can tell, there seems to be a division within the IMF itself between the research department, which sounds like it's very much more in favor of sort of stimulative growth-promoting policies, and other parts of the IMF which were less interested in such policies. So clearly the organization needs to solve its own problems before any administration can do this. Yeah.
all the questions are in my mind here. Well,
Maybe I should stand over here.
Am I right in thinking you're one of the first scholars to look at these newly found minutes from the Bretton Woods conference?
I think so, although it won't be long before everyone sees it.
Right, right. But I'd like to know what you found there. Were there any surprises there?
I think that what's surprising there is, or what's, well, I don't know if it's surprising, but what's in those news transcripts is sort of gratifying confirmation of a lot of the things that I think I already knew, but were not part of the literature. So for example, if you look at these transcripts, you can see, as I say, evidence of considerable good faith Soviet involvement, or at least active Soviet involvement, which is not something that's generally part of the record, but I think needs to be re-exhumed in understanding how we got to where we got to by the end of 1945. The Soviets, speak extensively and usually, constructively, at least from the point of view of establishing their own interests in this, and they bring a number of matters to a vote, which they mostly lose, but they are participating in the conference. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is this issue about the voting itself, which I mentioned in response to Ed's question. I think that you can see both how both White and Keynes managed the questions of voting at the conference, how Keynes, as I say, managed to avoid it altogether, how White tried to keep it to a minimum. Very few of the votes are actually recorded in terms of the numbers on either side of the question, but there are a number of instances where it says this was brought to a vote and it was either adopted or not. So you can see this question of how it operated in terms of a Proto UN, which I think is kind of intriguing and worth discussing. I would say that also what's interesting in these transcripts is you can see the extent and the character of the participation of the developing countries. Right, again, we tend to think of these things as, we tend to think of this as an Anglo-American stitch-up or even just as an American job. But in fact, you see considerable influence exerted by the developing countries at particular points. In one particularly poignant instance, it's the Greek representative who is the one saying, we really need the IMF to be involved in promoting prosperity among poor countries, as well as simply maintaining the existing order of exchange rates. Right? And there's actually a clause adopted to that effect, although in the end I'm not sure it did a whole lot of good. So those are at least three things of interest. I'm sure that other people will see other things of interest, but those happen to be some points that I thought were intriguing coming out of my own research, and I saw those in the documents. Nobody wants to ask about Harry Dexter White as a spy?
Do you think it made any difference that he was feeding stuff to the Soviets?
Well, no, that's the thing. I mean, even if Harry Dexter White was feeding lots of stuff to the Soviets, and there's no evidence that he was, there's evidence that he was feeding some stuff, as you say, to the Soviets, of probably a non-critical nature. Bretton Woods is like the capitalist system. How good a Soviet agent could he possibly have been if he was involved in creating this sort of, this dream of the free traders and the international capitalist order? Not very good, right? As far as I can tell, White's involvement with the Soviets was largely a matter of covert and illegal private diplomacy, right? An attempt to get them involved in the system, and one that failed ultimately. The only area in which it may have made any difference is some of the authors in the spy literature say, well, he told the Soviets at the time of the San Francisco conference that it was crucial to the administration that the conference not fail, so that therefore they could get whatever they want. Of course, as far as this is certainly bad negotiating tactics. The thing is, he said this to the Soviets before the Bretton Woods conference in front of a whole bunch of other people, and so it's hardly, as I say, covert behavior. It may be stupid, but it's not really necessarily spying.
Do you think it was his influence that kept the Soviets? You said you remarked how interested and participatory the Soviets were during the conference. Do you think White was keeping them on board?
It's not just White. I mean, it's the Morgenthau Treasury and it's the Roosevelt. I mean, again, you have to think about these things in the context of it's 1944. Right? It's 1944, D-Day is just underway. We're still depending on the Soviets to win on the Eastern Front. Right? That's even through 1944 and through early 1945. There's still no atomic bomb. Right? There's no such thing as sort of American military hegemony in the way that all of a sudden we're going to come to think of it by the end of 1945. And so the idea that we need the Soviets to be on board, especially if Britain is a declining empire, which it is, that's another thing that comes out of the transcripts, by the way, is how beholden Britain was to its colonial possessions. Right? The Indians and the Canadians and the South Africans and Australians had lent so much money to the Britons in the prosecution of the war that Britain was going to go under on those debts alone. So if Britain was going to be out of the picture, then the Soviets were the next logical anti-Nazi, anti-fascist ally to have. And so that's why they were treated the way they were through Bretton Woods. That's why Roosevelt treated them the way he did at Yalta, that they were the ones that the Americans had to conduct bilateral negotiations with because they were going to be the major other player in the post-war world. So it wasn't just White. And as far as I can tell in those talks that White held with the Soviets in spring of 1944, he wasn't particularly yielding in terms of giving them what they wanted. He sort of laid out the Treasury's position, and they said, well, we want this, and his response was usually, well, we'll see, or even, I don't think that's realistic. So again, if he was a Soviet agent, he wasn't a very good one. Yeah. Hi.
Getting back to the voting system,
Yeah.
in your reading, how contentious was it about how to figure out the quota system and then link the voting to the quota system?
This is another great story. I'm sure you know this, but there are all kinds of formulae you could come up with to justify a country's quota. Right? In the Keynes' original plan, it was supposed to be related to the volume of trade, right? Volume of international trade and things like that. But by the time you get down to actually doing the quota assigning, Harry Dexter White goes to his associate who he's told to do this, and he says, we need you to do this so that it comes out that the US has the biggest quota, the UK has the second biggest quota, and then the Soviets and the Chinese and then France. No, he didn't say then France. It said somebody else. And then the guy said, well, France should have a bigger one than China. And White said, I don't care. There were probably some fricatives in there. But he said, I don't care. He said, what matters politically is that China needs to be up there because that's what Franklin Roosevelt wants. And the Soviets need to be up there because that's what they want. Right? Because, again, the quota is tied to voting power. So that's what he does. He says, well, this is how it has to come out. And so then he sort of reverse engineers a quota formula to produce this result, which is largely, bunkum by his own account, right? And so they come up with this quota system. It produces a great deal of discontent at the conference because it is clearly not tied to the volume of trade or gross product or anything else. And again, particularly of the Commonwealth countries, the British Commonwealth countries, are unhappy about this, particularly the Indians, who see that they have this enormous, economic potential, that they should be up there with the Chinese at least, and therefore they should have another representative. There are all sorts of efforts to try to get another representative on the board of directors, if not by quota influence. So it provokes a controversy, but ultimately the engine behind it is this effort to make sure that the allied Big Four are at the top. Did that answer your question? Because the voting in the bank is not tied to the size of the quota, the Soviets don't want to contribute as much to the bank. So that they say, well, we're going to give to the fund, but we're not going to give an equal amount to the bank, even though everyone else had been have been required to give equal amounts. So the US Treasury actually decides to stump up what's lacking from the Soviet contribution and is giving extra. And at the last minute, at the conference, just at the signing of the final act, a telegram comes from Moscow authorizing the Soviets to give the full amount for the bank. So in fact, the bank ends up having a little extra in it because both the US and the Soviets have contributed what was lacking from the Soviet portion. So again, this is evidence, I think, of some kind of goodwill on the part of the Soviets in terms of participating in the Bretton Woods conference. Other questions? Nobody wants to ask more about the adjustable peg? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.